Ladies and gentlemen, fellas, welcome back to the channel and the podcast. And today we're going to be discussing the do not draft wide receivers for 2020. I made a video on this all the way back, I believe, in April. So we're just going to be updating that video, updating ADP, some players that stand out now. No major news has happened because we haven't had the preseason, and we might not have the preseason, and we haven't had much movement in general because of everything that has been going on. So not a lot of ways for athletes to, I would say, attend camps and beat writers to be there and get a lot of news from them. So not a lot of major news. So nothing major in the changes, but at least maybe some of the analysis, I believe, is probably going to change from that earlier video. And I'm sure not a lot of people actually saw, because in April, not a lot of people are caring, or at least the far majority of people don't care until July and August, and obviously early September for the 2020 redraft fantasy football season. So thank you for being here right now. My name is Vetri, and I cover fantasy sports in a variety of different sports. We're buckled up, we're on the roller coaster, we're chicken all the way up, and we're going to drop down for this 2020 season pretty shortly. I like the fact that you're here, you're preparing for it right now. Your league mates probably aren't. They're probably going to suck. You're probably going to beat them. All those things are probably true. So we're here right now. Do not draft wide receivers. I'm going to go through a couple of them. I think I have 3 or 4 honorable mentions. I think I have 4 to break down in pretty decent depth. On the screen behind me is just the wide receiver player profiles on the Supreme Draft Guide. You can get it down below. There's going to be continued more to be added, but every single one of these you click on, we'll click on some throughout. One of the ones that is going to be starting up is on the screen right now for one of the guys that is a do not draft for me. So we'll start there. If we can, right before we get into this, hit the like button. Big old subscribe button just popped up. Be sure to hit that if you're listening on the podcast. $50 giveaway every single week. Only 3 people leave a review and subscribe to the podcast. You leave a 5-star review, say something nice. It literally takes 30 seconds. You'll be entered into a raffle for that week's $50 giveaway, and you'll probably have a 20 to 30% chance, depending on how many people from this YouTube video and podcast now go over there. So sorry for blowing up anybody's spot that was planning on doing it before me promoting it. Check out the Supreme Draft Guide down below. It's a limited time offer only for $10 thanks to Monkey Knife Fight. Otherwise, it's $30 on the site. All the information for that is linked down below in the description. All the player profiles, the rankings, the stats, all that stuff. It's a great value. Go ahead, get it. Let's give you some more value than anybody else is probably going to give you in the goddamn industry. So we're going to start with the first guy right now, who's going to be Cortland Sutton. Cortland Sutton is somebody that probably not going to be drafting. Cortland Sutton right now is currently going as the wide receiver. I think he's fallen. He was going earlier in the summer and really the freaking spring as wide receiver 12. I think he's down to wide receiver 18 according to Fantasy Pros ADP right now, but he's still outside my top 24 wide receivers. He's right now pushing being outside my top 25 wide receivers for redraft formats, and this is why. In 2019, he played 16 games, and he was great. 95% of the snaps. He went for 72 receptions, over 1,100 yards, and 6 touchdowns on 126 targets. 26% target share, 28.2% red zone target share, one of the highest in the league. And he did this patching it together with not so great quarterback play from guys just filling in, from Drew Lock for those final 5 or 6 games of the season last year. And if you're looking at it, that's the big reason why. There's 2 big reasons why you don't like Cortland Sutton as much this year, or at least you don't draft him as where he was pretty much finishing last year, like a lot of people earlier on this year were doing, and really right now they're even still doing to an extent. And the first of those 2 big reasons is Drew Lock might just suck, right? They put so much talent around him, which is the second reason, so more quote-unquote mouths to feed. Cortland Sutton's the alpha out there. I'm not going to be concerned with Cortland Sutton not getting his. The whole mouths to feed thing is if the guys in the back end, the KJ Hamlers that were drafted, right? The tight ends maybe, Noah Fant I'm not too worried about, but Albert O. It's those guys having an opportunity to get more opportunity, right? More targets, more volume, all that. Cortland Sutton, I'm not too concerned about that. I personally am just concerned that Drew Lock probably just sucks. And that's just my take on it based on watching 5 games on him, based on watching his tape from when he came out doing the evaluation there. I don't really have much faith in Drew Lock. And you could prop up a quarterback. You could prop him up with talent. You could prop him up with offensive line play, which they did. Very under the radar offensive line ad from the Detroit Lions in Graham Glasgow. So I think that's actually a bigger need and a bigger issue for just having good offensive line play for him. But they give him a ton of weapons, both from tight ends to wide receivers that are rookies to obviously Melvin Gordon. So there's everything now around Drew Lock, but what if he just sucks? And there's a good chance that is. And based on the ADP right now, I think a lot of people are just assuming that Drew Lock is going to be good or better than expected. And I think that's a fair statement if you want to make the argument that the talent around him props him up enough. But if I'm here to make the argument that Drew Lock is average, well, then I think Cortland Sutton's outside the top 20 and closer to the top 25 wide receiver. And if I think that Drew Lock sucks, which I'm not going to say he is the worst quarterback in the league, but if I'm going to project him to be a bottom 10 starting quarterback in the league, bottom 5 even, well, then Cortland Sutton starts to become a wide receiver 25, 26, 27 in my projections and rankings for me. Those final 5 games last year with Drew Lock, I'll pop it up on the screen right now, 22 receptions, 280 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 39 targets. He actually saw 7.8 targets per game. His ADOT reduced. His whole volume volume actually went up. His targets per game were going up based on his previous 11 games. So he saw 50% of his end zone targets in those final 6 games, in those final 5 games, which is pretty good. He was being targeted in the end zone by Drew Lock. So his volume wasn't going anywhere. The whole narrative that there's so much more talent here, I don't think it's going to affect him all that much. He's still the only true alpha on the outside. Tim Patrick is not taking his snaps. Jerry Jeudy and Hamler can split those slot snaps all they want. Hamler maybe goes to the outside a little bit, but nobody's really a true alpha like Cortland Sutton on this team. So his overall volume went up, so that's good to see, but his overall efficiency completely dropped because, well, Drew Lock just wasn't good last year in general. His completion percentage was pretty abysmal. You had Cortland Sutton scoring 10.6 fantasy points per game with Lock, 14.4 in the 11 games without Lock. So his fantasy points per game dropped by about 4 per game. That's not great. His yards per reception dropped by 3 yards. So having a struggle to complete deep passes was something that Drew Lock was known for. Having a struggle to just complete really any intermediate, difficult type of throws was really a struggle for Drew Lock as well. Denver was throwing the 25th most times per game as their defense picked up to the mid to end of the year last year, and they had a rookie, of course, in Lock for the final 5 games, so maybe you don't throw as much, just 34.1 attempts per game. Lock attempted 31.2 attempts per game himself, 204 yards per game, and just 7 touchdowns, a 4.5% rate. So I think a big factor is obviously the quarterback play, and now what else they did in the offseason is going to be another factor. They had Melvin Gordon, Nick Vannett, a blocking tight end primarily, and Graham Glasgow, who I think was one of the more underrated moves. Some of these offensive line moves have gone very underrated, and I think one of the biggest ones is Graham Glasgow. Melvin Gordon has just kind of been forgotten about because he's somebody that happened in free agency really well before the free agency period ended, and then also obviously the NFL draft, which was the biggest spectacular event of the entire summer for so far, the NFL season, and really most sports, that live draft, the virtual draft. And then the NFL draft, they get Jerry Jeudy and Hamler in back-to-back picks. They get Albert O in the 4th round, and then they pick up another wide receiver in the 7th round who probably doesn't make much of an impact in Tyree Cleveland. So you had all these pieces now, 2 slot receivers primarily that play similar roles, very fast wide receivers. Hamler probably the fastest receiver on this team now, and then Jerry Jeudy, 2 burners out of the slot. You have also Jerry Jeudy being a very technical route runner. Both guys can play on the outside. Mainly Hamler, I think, would go there more often. So now you're in this situation where, okay, you have a lot of talent at wide receiver. They get Albert O, so now they have depth and speed at tight end. So they have good depth pieces, and obviously you have Philip Lindsay and even Royce Freeman at this point behind Melvin Gordon. So the offense is built up, looks to be good. Cortland Sutton looks to still be the alpha, and if by a far margin, in my opinion, but not a top 18, not a borderline top 15 receiver for me because of the fact that I think his quarterback might just stink. So the target competition does come down to the 2 rookie wide receivers, to Melvin Gordon and to an extent. I don't know if he'll catch as many passes now that he's not attached to Phillip Rivers. And then you have guys like potentially Deshaun Hamilton, if he's still going to make this team. He'll probably be replaced by his own Penn State alumni friend himself in KJ Hamler. So Jerry Jeudy you had in 2019, he had over 1,100 yards. He had 10 touchdowns on a 25% target share. Hamler, very similar, had a 25% target share on 94 targets, 904 yards and 8 touchdowns. And then Noah Fant last year, potential breakout candidate, potential right up there with TJ Hawkinson, his former teammate for the tight ends this year, coming into their 2nd year, potentially looking to break out. 68% of the snaps, dealt with a foot injury down the stretch, but didn't miss any games. He had 67 targets, 562 yards, and 3 touchdowns for playing with pretty bad quarterback play. Nothing spectacular, and being a rookie is a pretty good rookie tight end season. So for me, it's all about ADPs, and that's where you want to do not draft off of. And right now, for me, I'm skipping Cortland Sutton wherever he's being drafted. I'm taking a ton of wide receivers around him. And I mean, the wide receivers that I'm currently taking around Cortland Sutton range from guys like Devontae Parker, range from guys like DK Metcalf, T.Y. Hilton, even Terry McLaurin right now. I'm borderline taking over him. So those types of names are all around him that I would just rather have at this point. A.J. Brown, of course, is going to be up there for me. Keenan Allen's. All those types of names I'd rather have. DJ Shark even, I think, is one spot ahead of Cortland Sutton for me. Next up for me is Mike Williams. And since my last video on this topic, Mike Williams has dropped. He was going as like the wide receiver 38. He has now dropped to going as like the wide receiver 43, wide receiver 44 on some sites. He's my wide receiver 49. He's very close to being bumped outside my top 50 because there's some young and exciting rookies or 2nd-year wide receivers that I like that I currently have in my early 50s. I think guys like Denzel Mims. I think some other guys like Michael Pittman might be around there. But Mike Williams for me is somebody that I just don't want to have any pieces of, to be completely honest with you, unless he's dropping for some reason like 2 rounds, which there's a good chance that he does if a lot of people start to avoid him based on the alarming facts that you have to kind of look at for his 2020 campaign compared to his 2019 season. So the first one is that he's being drafted at ADP as a top 45 wide receiver when I think he's a wide receiver 49 at best right now, so I'm just never going to really want to get there at all. In 2019, he just had sort of an in-between season, right? He had all the the touchdowns the season before, and it was like, okay, that's probably going to regress. And then that regressed to a major way with him only scoring last year 2 touchdowns, but what regressed in a positive way to kind of balance it out was the fact that he had only 49 receptions and still broke 1,000 yards, 1,001 yards to be exact, because his yards per reception was just so elite. So he caught 49 passes, as you can see here, on 90 targets last year, just a 16.5% target share, just 49 receptions, still broke 1,000 yards and had just 2 touchdowns. Now he actually dropped a touchdown, and what would have probably been like a 60-yard touchdown, I remember, as well in a primetime game. Philip Rivers overthrew him on what would have likely been another 40-yard reception, maybe a touchdown. So his numbers could have even been better last year from both a yards per perspective standpoint. And like just those 2 plays alone, that's 52 receptions or 51 receptions for like 1,100 yards. Now you have 3 touchdowns. Now you're jumping up like 6 spots in the wide receiver finishes last year. He was 25th in overall yards last year, but he was number 2 in yards per reception at 20.4 per, and number 1 in average target distance. What this pretty much means is that out of all the wide receivers in the league, Philip Rivers was targeting him the deepest downfield, and he was number 2 in actually bringing in those overall targets. But he finished as the wide receiver 39 last year on all of these numbers. Now you can tell me if he's going to get 90 targets and he's going to produce in this way, then he's not going to score just 2 touchdowns. I would argue that he's not just a deep threat as well. Like he should see more touchdown usage. 21.1% red zone usage last year. He just got overshadowed by Austin Eckler, by the running game when Melvin Gordon came back, by obviously Keenan Allen and even Hunter Henry, who were using the red zone a decent amount. So now you're in a situation where, okay, Mike Williams is still on this team, but Philip Rivers is not. And how much do you trust Tyrod Taylor throwing it deep downfield? I think Tyrod Taylor is accurate, but I don't know if I trust him to unload it as much. And that's probably a good thing for the Chargers because Philip Rivers was taking a lot of unnecessary risks and really his whole career, but also last year for the Chargers. The Chargers did throw the 10th most times per game last year. A lot of checkdowns, of course, to Eckler when he has over 1,000 or over 100 targets, that is, and close to 1,000 receiving yards. But you're looking at what the Chargers did in the offseason. They had Brian Bulaga. They traded for Trey Turner. They had Donald Palm, a tight end from the Dallas Renegades, the XFL team, but they shore up their offensive line a little bit. They end up losing Philip Rivers, some veterans in Melvin Gordon and Russell Okung. Okung was actually a trade for Trey Turner. And then you can see in the NFL draft, they go through, they get Justin Herbert. They go and they get a running back in the 4th round in Joshua Kelly, who's likely going to be battling for Justin Jackson. I assume Jackson will take the early lead as the Melvin Gordon role from last year. And then they get Joe Reed and KJ Hill. I actually like Joe Reed, wide receiver from Virginia who played some special teams. He'll probably threaten as a wide receiver 3 option on this team because they really haven't had one in 2 years with Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Joe Reed. Then you get your Hunter Henry and your backfield, Austin Eckler, and then Joshua Kelly / Justin Jackson back there. But the biggest thing for me is like, one, the quarterback play is not the same. A similar concern for guys like Eckler and even Keenan Allen, and now all of them really, right? You have Tyrod Taylor coming in, who a guy might throw accurate, might be somewhat of a Teddy Bridgewater in terms of how deep he's going to throw downfield, and he's going to take off a little bit more and be mobile. So you're not going to have, I don't think, as much success just naturally. Even if Philip Rivers was still here, you're probably going to get a regression towards the mean of not having 20.4 yards per reception. It's probably going to drop a decent amount at least, right? And if that's going to happen, and your overall targets now, since it's similar competition and some rookie wide receivers come in, stay around that 90 range, well, now your receptions are dropping. Maybe you score 1 to 2 more touchdowns and it balances out, and then you end up being the wide receiver 40. But when there was like 10 rookie wide receivers who produced last year, now they're coming into a second year, and there was literally 20 rookie wide receivers who are going to have an opportunity to produce this year, I think it just naturally drops down these buffer players like a Mike Williams, and you factor in just a quarterback change and him not even being like a top 3 option on his own team. I think last year was maybe a career year for him in terms of the yardage, so I'm going to be a little bit further down the list on Mike Williams and his ADP. You have guys like Keenan Allen, who played over 90% of the snaps, caught over 100 balls last year, about 1,200 yards and 6 touchdowns, 150 targets. That will change a little bit, of course, with Tyrod Taylor, but I still think he's going to be the primary option out of the slot. You have Eckler, of course, who had 104 targets last year. Again, with Taylor being mobile, that likely changes a decent amount. You have Hunter Henry seeing 76 targets, even though he was injured. Like, those 3 guys are likely ahead of Mike Williams, at least on this team's skill level in the pecking order. It's going to come down to who Tyrod Taylor factors and favors the most. And then again, Joe Reed out of college. Joe Reed ended up catching 77 balls last year, played on special teams, but he saw 22% target share, 116 yards. So for me, Mike Williams, it's not as bad as it was earlier in the summer, but he's still a guy that I just have really no interest in drafting. The next guy up on the do not draft wide receivers list, and if you can for a second here, hit the like button if you're watching on YouTube. Big old subscribe button pops up on the screen on YouTube. Doing those things and also hitting the notification bell are all a free way to support this channel. It really does help the channel grow as well when you do it within the channel. I'm really hoping that this summer in August and maybe even July, the month that you're watching this, we can get some really huge growth. I'm talking like 20 to 50,000, maybe even 100,000 views on a video, but doing that is really what pushes that up the YouTube algorithm and says these people are liking it, they're engaging and subscribing within the content. Let's show it to more people. Let's pop this video off. So I really do appreciate it if you could do that for me, totally free. The next player up, as we now go to the Supreme Draft Guide, is a little preview of some of of the player profiles in here. We're adding these pretty much by the day, a lot more tight end and quarterback ones to come. But what you can see here is just all the information that you need to know. So if you get this draft guide, this Supreme Draft Guide, just $10 thanks to Monkey Knife Fight. Limited time offer only. So if you're watching this, be sure to take advantage of it before it goes away. You're going to be able to see what they did at a glance last year, what the team added and subtracted for this offseason, what he has done in the past based on his injury status, and then the target competition that he'll be dealing with this year. So for Tyler Boyd's case, if we just want to look at why he's a do not draft for me, well, Tyler Boyd is currently going, and he's dropped a little bit, but he's still currently going. He's right around the wide receiver 30. He's my wide receiver 40 right now. And it's really nothing against Tyler Boyd. I don't mind and I don't hate Tyler Boyd. But you have guys on his team coming back. AJ Green's coming back. They drafted T. Higgins, who, look, I probably like AJ Green more than consensus. I think I'm actually right with consensus right now. So I like AJ Green more than Tyler Boyd on this team in the receiving game. I think you should. I like Joe Mixon a lot on this team. So I think I favor the running game and even the check down game to Joe Mixon. And then I don't really like T. Higgins. He's not going to be ranked higher than Tyler Boyd for me. I'm not on that bandwagon. Maybe in Dynasty. Like, I think Tyler Boyd's a solid option, but I don't think you draft a solid option, maybe even a safe option as like your wide receiver 30. Like right now, Jarvis Landry's going as wide receiver 29. He's just coming off of a top 10 season last year. He's a guy who I think can put up 1,100 yards and 6 touchdowns on 80 or 90 receptions. I don't think Tyler Boyd can do that when AJ Green is healthy, right? I don't think Tyler Boyd as a wide receiver 2, I think he's going to be more efficient, right? He'll have a less top-end cornerback play he'll have to go up against, but I think his receptions are going to drop by maybe 10 to 20 receptions, which drops his yardage and then drops his touchdowns 1 to 2 to 3 potentially. So with that being said, it's me not hating the talent. I actually think he's a talented receiver. It's just the fact that now AJ Green is back, a true alpha there. You have some other competition to deal with. John Ross is potentially going to be healthier as he started to break out a little bit last year and show some of that first round upside that he was drafted at. So it's just more so a fact that I like other guys around Tyler Boyd, and there's going to be more competition on his team for a guy who I don't think is a true alpha number 1 ever, like he was last year when he ended up seeing 147 targets, which is just absolutely insane. Was 7th in the NFL last year in targets. I'll zoom in on some of these key stats from the 2019 season here. But as you can see, played 92% of the snaps, caught 90 of 147 targets, 24.9% share. Never really used in the red zone though, just 14.7% red zone share. Had 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns. He was likely due to regress for touchdowns, right? If he was just using the red zone. He had 147 targets, just 5 touchdowns. Very Robert Woods-esque last year in terms of this guy seeing pretty much every single target out there, just not seeing much in the red zone and not ending up scoring touchdowns on them drives. But he was a top 10 player in so many categories: receptions, targets, yak. And when you look at his overall drops, he had 10, which is a negative way to be, but he looked pretty good all around. He was 93rd in ADOT, 83rd in yards per reception. That's the issue, right? He was running out of the slot a lot, and he's just not an elite wide receiver 1. That doesn't mean he's not bad. He's a very good wide receiver 2. He's one of the best wide receiver 2s in the league, in my opinion. I mean, he's very much in that category of Michael Gallup, Christian Kirk for me, all those types of receivers in that range and that standpoint. Deontay Johnson coming into this year based on where he's being drafted, he's just behind all of those guys for me. And when he's behind 3 or 4 of those wide receiver 2s that I personally like myself, maybe a Jamison Crowder in there, instead of being the wide receiver 30 like he is for consensus, he starts to drop 10 spots for me to my wide receiver 40 spot. And now we can look what the Bengals did in the offseason here, the team additions and subtractions. I have these for every single team. You don't even have to go just inside the player profiles themselves, but there'll be like a whole drop down page for it, so you can check those out. But pretty much what they did was in free agency, nothing. You can see those names there on the left side in green. You don't recognize any of them. Mike Thomas, a former Jacksonville Jaguar wide receiver who was a depth piece. Jaquez Patrick, if you watch the XFL, but really nothing there. What did they lose? Well, Tyler Eifert, longtime tight end, who actually stayed healthy for 16 games last year. They lose a tackle in Cordy Glenn. So their offensive line was pretty bad last year. So it was a lot of injuries. It was Jonah Williams, a former first-round pick, being hurt. But they didn't do really anything to help with that in the NFL draft outside of adding a 6th-round tackle. And then really all they had was to be on the clock for months and draft Joe Burrow. And then they ended up at the first pick of the 2nd round going T. Higgins over Michael Pittman, which I kind of scratched my head at. I guess it's not a major issue, but much rather have Michael Pittman, even Denzel Mims at that point, who went at the end of the 2nd round. So that's what they did. So they added competition, yes, for a guy in Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins, but it's still going to be, in my opinion, Tyler Boyd in the slot, AJ Green on the outside, and John Ross on the outside, with T. Higgins factoring in a little bit to start the season. We'll see how it goes as the season goes on. Here's your target competition, and I just pretty much said the names: AJ Green, Auden Tate, John Ross, T. Higgins, then Joe Mixon. And I forgot to say, Auden Tate is on this team. He's a jump ball specialist. He was fantastic last year when he was a wide receiver 2. He was targeted in the red zone a ton. Of course, that wasn't by Joe Burrow, but still a ton. And he was catching everything that came his way. I would say this is the one big upside for Tyler Boyd in terms of, instead of him being producing as the wide receiver 40, where I have him ranked, actually producing closer to ADP as the wide receiver 30. Joe Burrow last year threw a ton to Justin Jefferson in the slot, one of the highest rates in all of college football, and produced the highest yardage to that spot. But that is a skewed number because they obviously won the college football championship, so they got to play in an extra 2 to 3 more games than anybody else did. So that's one thing to start with, right? So that's an issue. But and then it's also Justin Jefferson was out of the slot, one of the best wide receivers in college football. So it's a little bit skewed there. Like I do think Tyler Boyd at this point is better than Justin Jefferson. You can't even argue that with me in their careers based on what we've seen. One production year in college out of Justin Jefferson compared to Tyler Boyd being good in college and then also coming to the NFL and having 2 productive years. It's not even close. So that is a saving grace for you if you do want to be drafting Tyler Boyd at or above consensus. I can't see drafting Tyler Boyd as a top 25 wide receiver right now. But if you wanted to, your argument would be Joe Burrow tore it up through the slot last year. He loves throwing to the slot. If that's the case, Tyler Boyd's going to be in the slot. That's where I want to go. And I think that's a fair way to look at it. Tyler Boyd primarily probably does run out of the slot. We didn't see any AJ Green last year. You can see the last time we saw him was 9 games in 2018. He's always been a top 12 wide receiver whenever he is healthy. 77 yards per game, 5.1 receptions per game on 8.6 targets per game that year, a 23.5% target share, primarily with his man Andy Dalton. T. Higgins in college caught 59 balls on 80 targets. It's just a 15.7% target share, over 1,150 yards. I'm not the biggest T. Higgins fan. Again, I thought Michael Pittman, Denzel Mims were better options for that team, maybe even Laviska Shenault before drafting a guy in T. Higgins, but I understand why they did it. I guess he fits this system somewhat nicely, but they have so many other wide receivers right now. John Ross in just 8 games last year started to break out. The first 2 games, he was the wide receiver 1 in all fantasy through 3 weeks of the season, but a lot of it was skewed. He ended up having 2 touchdowns, literally on blown coverages. So when you're going to be scoring 120 yards and 2 touchdowns on 2 receptions in the first 2 to 3 weeks of the season on blown coverages, you're going to be propped up higher than you actually should be. But he had 28 receptions on 56 targets, 506 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He had a good year. 7 targets per game, 3.5 receptions per game, and 63 yards per game. And then Auden Tate, who's really going to be pushed down just because AJ Green is back and the fact that they drafted T. Higgins. I liked Auden Tate. I think Auden Tate should still get chances above T. Higgins, in my opinion, at least to start the season. He was good last year. Again, just called on at the last minute. He saw 81 targets, 6.8 targets per game, and a 24.6% red zone share. Again, AJ Green, if healthy, probably takes away from that red zone share, but I don't think he's going to be taking away from it all that much. You want Auden Tate on the field in the red zone, especially with Tyler Eifert gone. In my opinion, you want Auden Tate and AJ Green over guys like John Ross and Tyler Boyd just based on their size and jump ball ability. That's what Auden Tate was known for coming out of the NFL draft when he came out. He was a jump ball specialist, and he proved that last year. Every single jump ball that came his way, go look at Auden Tate highlight reels. They're absolutely insane. So for me personally, I love Tyler Boyd. I play him in DFS a ton in the last 2 years. I had him on my teams last year, so I like Tyler Boyd myself. It's just the fact that now things have changed. He's being drafted as if AJ Green, in my opinion, is just not coming back right now. He's being drafted as a top 30 wide receiver. He's being drafted as a high-end wide receiver 3 or a low-end wide receiver 2. And the way that I look at it right now is just that's not the case. I see him more so as at best a low-end wide receiver 3 for what's going on in this offense. And then you also have to factor in, is Joe Burrow even going to be good in this offense? Their schedule is brutal. They might only win 2 or 3 games. How much does that actually reflect the wide receiver production? Not only the wide receiver production, but the hodgepodge of guys behind AJ Green and the guys behind this team in general and priorities of AJ Green and Joe Mixon in the running game. So it's going to seem like I just hate the Denver Broncos this year, although I think they're going to be a fun and exciting team. But there's just no way I'm drafting Jerry Jeudy as the wide receiver 38. I don't think you should draft any rookie that high unless they're obviously standout values. And Jerry Jeudy's not even going to be a true alpha receiver. If this was CeeDee Lamb on a team that needed a wide receiver instead of where he went with the Cowboys, then yeah, I guess you can take him this high. But Jerry Jeudy going as the wide receiver 38, he's ranked as my wide receiver 47. He's not even my first wide receiver off the board. I think that Jerry Jeudy right now is going to be overvalued in a lot of drafts for a guy whose role is going to be to run out of the slot and not produce in a major way. Now, Jerry Jeudy, yes, he can catch 50 to 60 balls this year, but he's not going to be a guy for you that, one, I don't think he's used heavily in the red zone unless he has a above expectation type of a year. And I don't think he's going to be a huge A-dot guy. He can get a lot of yards after the catch based on his route running and separation abilities, at least in college that we saw, but he's not a guy that I'm going out there and drafting as a top 40 wide receiver. No, there's just no way in my opinion. There are so many other players that I would rather be having. And I mean, one of them we already talked about is Tyler Boyd. I'd rather be having Tyler Boyd over Jerry Jeudy. And I don't even really want Tyler Boyd, but there's so many other guys. There's so many other rookies. Michael Pittman's up there for guys I'd rather have. CeeDee Lamb is right there. I don't want to be taking reaches on these rookies who don't have a clear path to being an alpha. Unless Cortland Sutton gets hurt, Jerry Jeudy doesn't have a clear path of being an alpha. And even then, you're going to have guys like Tim Patrick on the outside and Jeudy not moving to the outside all that much. So Jeudy in Alabama was great. I mean, I liked him. His route running is probably the best coming out of the draft, but how much does that really matter coming into the league now after you separate it from the other rookie wide receivers you're just trying to draft if you're a GM? In 2019, he caught 77 balls. 54.3% of his snaps came out of the slot, so he can obviously move to the outside if he needs to. Played 600 total snaps, over 100 targets, 108 to be exact, 15.3 yards per reception. He ended up seeing 59% of his targets, which was 64 slot targets, come from the slot last season. The positives are he's a crisp route runner. 3.49 yards per reception from the slot was an elite number. His speed, his open field ability as a weapon as well SALNFL is another positive, and then you get to just face worse cornerbacks when you're coming out of the slot, either if it's college football or the NFL. Negatives is his catch radius. He's just not a big wide receiver in general. Doesn't have much of a catch radius, doesn't have much burst in general. Outside of the speed, there's not a lot of intangibles or workout metrics, as you can see behind me, that really pop off for him. And he didn't have to face much press coverage based on the offense he was in Alabama with Tua for a lot of that time, and him being in the slot. There was just never really, you're not going to get a lot of press coverage in general out of the slot, so that helps his route running ability. So Jerry Jeudy, for me, I like the talent. He's just, these rookies I don't want to be taking as top 40 wide receivers when there's proven guys there. Like the fact that Christian Kirk is going right around him, right? The fact that Marvin Jones is going right around or after him on ADP on average right now is just people trying to overreach on the shiny new toy. And in my opinion, you don't have to be doing that, especially when he's not the wide receiver one in his offense. So those are the four main guys that I don't want to be drafting. Some honorable mentions. I mean, Larry Fitzgerald, he's currently going as like a top 70 wide receiver right around there. I wouldn't even draft him in the top 100, to be honest with you. Amari Cooper is another one that I've done specific videos on. Same thing for DeAndre Hopkins. These are guys that you don't have to draft. And again, it's all based on ADP. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be drafting these guys if they drop. If DeAndre Hopkins drops to the end of the second round, sure, get him. But when he's getting drafted right now as a 12th overall player, there's a 0% chance I want to get him. I don't like him at all based on his ADP. Same thing can be said for guys like Cooper Kupp. If he's going to be drafted as a number 12 wide receiver, but he's my wide receiver 18, I'm just not going to be drafting him. Same thing can be said for Amari Cooper. If he's going to be drafted as a number 9 or number 10 wide receiver, and he's my wide receiver 15 or 16, I'm just not going to be drafting him. So it's not extreme cases as it is for some of the guys we just broke down in depth, but it is a situation where these guys are do not drafts for me based on ADP. If they fall 1 to 2 rounds, sure, go ahead and get them. So that's where I'm at right now. Do not draft wide receivers. Be sure before you leave, take a second at a time. If you just had a good time, you enjoyed all that, you got to crack your neck, you got to crack your back, stretch a little bit right now, and then now that you're all loosened up, get ready to hit the like button real quick, the big old subscribe button. Podcast version, you want to make $50 or have a good chance to, leave a podcast review, and you have entered into a raffle for the week for podcast reviews, 5-star review on Apple. Go ahead, do it, or whatever platform really works for you. Apple is the primary option, though, for that. And then check out the Supreme Draft Guide. You can get the Supreme Draft Guide, all the wide receiver profiles, really all the different profiles as well, the rankings, the key stats, all that stuff is available on the Supreme Draft Guide. Go ahead, get it. What are you waiting for? Go crush your league mates. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'm going to see you in the next one. I got videos releasing like 5 days a week right now. We're going to go daily, 7 days a week once August comes. Thank you all so much. Appreciate you all. Love you all. And I'll see you in the next one.